All right, good morning. My name is Mike Smith. I'm here with General James E. Livingston. We're in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. Today's date is April 23rd, 2025. And General Livingston, just before we get started, do we have your permission to record this?
That's correct. I have no issue.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you so much for having us here today
Well, thank
and for
you.
your hospitality. If we could just start off with the interview, just if you can just briefly give us a description of where you were born, where you grew up, and that some of that early family life.
Well, I was born on January the 12th, 1940, in the state of Georgia, in a county of Telfair County, close to this town of Towns, Georgia. And I was a grown. My parents were farmers, and I grew up on a farm my whole time in grammar school, middle school, and high school. Learned to work real hard and went to very small schools that were indicative at the time. But it was a very rural life, and it's very focused on studying, but it's also focused very much on work and attitude about working. There was high expectations of kids to be able to perform on the farm. So I learned working real early down in the rural state of Georgia.
And what did you grow on the farm?
We grew everything. We had a huge farm, so you name it. We had tobacco, we had cotton, we had watermelons, all kind of produce, big corn, sugar cane, everything that you could almost grow in the state of Georgia, we produced. And we would have as many as 100 people working on that farm because you didn't have all the machinery to pick cotton and do those things like you have today in corn. So a lot of people worked for us, and so we were big producers in the family and for the neighborhood and for the area. So we got to be knowledgeable of all the folks in the area, and were very supportive of them. My dad was a very supportive person.
So, quite the small, rural southern community back in the 1940s.
It was very much the 40s and 50s, as I grew up in that area. It was very much rural, but very much attuned to the needs of the community, and it was very much had formative factors on my life.
Yes, sir. Where did you go to high school at, and how was the high school?
Well, started out at Towns, Georgia grammar school, and I transferred from there to a place called Lumber City, Georgia, which was about 5 miles from where I lived. And I went to mid school there, and I went to high school, and my high school was a very small high school. My graduating class only had 26 students in that class, and unfortunately all of them are deceased now except for 3 or 4 of them.
And as you just briefly mentioned in some of the other interviews that I've had the pleasure of watching, you described like growing up in this rural farming community and working hard
Yeah.
on the farm really shaped some early hard-working lessons in your life.
Yeah.
How did that carry forward after high school?
Well, when people asked me when I went in the Marine Corps, that's going to be tough, I said it's no tougher and not near as tough as what I was raised on a farm and associated with in rural Georgia. My dad used to get me up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'd pump, and we had mules. When I first started farming, we had 17 mules, and my job was to pump water for them. And we finally began transitioning to tractors, and I recall the first small tractor we had, I said, Jesus Christ, I don't have to pump water for this doggone thing. So this was the kind of hard work, and it was a 7-day-a-week job, particularly in the summer months, because of all the produce and all the selling of produce and all that. So I learned hard work very early in life, so the thoughts of the Marine Corps being tough was not a problem with me. I had been there and done that.
You're in great physical shape once you arrived there.
Yeah. I was when I was at Auburn as a student, I used to work out every day, and when I got to Quantico and was associated with the O course like the one down in Auburn, just naming it to me, I could always max the O course, and I've continued that till today. I work out every day, a couple hours a day. I just had my workout this morning before y'all came. And it's head work for me as much as it is physical work. I got to do it.
Yes. Did the military tradition run in your family from your father, your uncles, or?
Not very much in my family. The only uncle I had was quite a character. It was in World War II. He was a member of the 82nd Airborne. And he used to come home when, looking sharp in his shine airborne boots and his cocked 82nd Airborne hat. And, he was sort of the pride of the family a little bit. He had made 2 combat jumps during World War II. So he was quite the man, but he had been demoted as many times as he had promoted. So he was a character, and I always loved him, and he always set a good example about what the military did. I enjoyed listening to his, quote, sea stories.
Can you take us from high school to Auburn University? What that looked like? Did you have a stop in between and before?
Well, my dad said you're probably not prepared to go to a big college, and you probably need something that has some sort of disciplinary factor about it. And there's a great little school called North Georgia College, which now is the University of North Georgia. And he decided that's where they would send me. And fortunately they did. My study habits, even though I made good grades in Lumber City, I was not up to tune to the students coming from the better schools around the country. So I spent 1 year at North Georgia, and basically I spent it locked up trying to keep my grades up. And if you didn't have a particular grade point average, you didn't get any outside liberty on the weekend except for a little bit on Saturday afternoon. So I think the thing that I've learned at Georgia, and it transferred into the Marine Corps, was not only the association with the military, but the discipline in yourself. And I don't think I'd been near successful at Auburn. And if you look at my first quarter at Auburn, we won't talk about, because I lived in the fraternity house. And if it hadn't been for that, I'd never made it, because I was not prepared for the rigor of even the North Georgia environment or the Auburn environment. So I think a salvation for me, both in my academic experiences and in my military beginning experiences, was my association with North Georgia. And I really admire that school. It's a beautiful campus. And I'm the only Medal of Honor recipient from North Georgia College. And they're doing a display at North Georgia, which will open in a couple of years, hopefully.
Were you a member of the Corps of Cadets there?
I was a member of the Corps of Cadets. All guys had to be members of the Corps of Cadets. There was no ladies involved in it, but they had ladies at the school. But all the males had to spend the whole time, if they attended North Georgia, they had to spend 4 years with the Corps of Cadets. And I had 1 year of Army ROTC there. Then I had transferred to Auburn because it was a land-grant college, and all guys at Auburn in those days were required to have 2 years of ROTC. So I went from the Army to the Air Force, and I did that because the Air Force guys didn't have to carry rifles.
So as you transitioned to Auburn, you sought Auburn out from North Georgia. Why, and how was those first years at Auburn University?
Well, I wanted to be an engineer, and that was the reason I didn't stay at North Georgia College. They didn't have an engineering curriculum, but had sort of a little pre-engineer. So I made it a choice. Being from Georgia, I looked at Georgia Tech, and I looked at Auburn University, and I always give the joke. I went down to Georgia Tech, and it was not in a nice area back in those days. It is now. And they only had 12 girls there, and they were all ugly. So I went over to Auburn, and I saw all those good-looking girls, and I told my dad, I think Auburn's a better choice for me.
And as you're arriving at Auburn, you said you were in a fraternity there. What fraternity was it?
I was in the Sigma Pi fraternity, and I transferred from North Georgia and began my life at Auburn, living in the fraternity house, which was a major mistake. And I almost flunked out because I hadn't sort of had free reign, if you will. So Auburn gave me a free reign, and living in a fraternity house gave me more free reign. But it was a good experience with the brothers, and we get together. But I just couldn't go through an engineering curriculum and live in a fraternity house. And I always tell the story, I almost flunked out my first quarter, and the only thing that saved me was a music appreciation. And I recognized William Tell's Overture, which is the Long Ranger song, and that saved me from flunking out of Auburn. But I moved out of the fraternity house, and my dad said, you better get with it, and I'm bringing you back. And see that tractor over there, that's where you're going to be attached to if you don't get your academics squared away. So I said, I got it.
So as you're progressing through Auburn University, the College of Engineering, and that curriculum, Vietnam is starting to materialize.
Well, a little bit, but not too much. It was being probably talked about, but I was just not, you're just not attuned to the news that much. And when I first went to Quantico, they was beginning to send advisors. This was in the early 60s. I'm talking about 60, 61. So Vietnam was not really a factor. Maybe there were a few early advisors there, I think, but there was no major contribution to that war on the part of the U.S. except for those advisors. So I didn't know very much about Vietnam, and but I got my draft notice at Auburn. It's what got me in the Marine Corps because I had no intention of going in the military. Knew nothing about the Marine Corps. So I got a draft notice and I sent it off to the OSO, Officer Selection Officer in Birmingham, Alabama. And a guy came up from Birmingham and came to this whole student union there at Auburn, and that's where he met. He was in his dress blues, and the guy really looked good. I mean, he was this one sharp strike Marine, to use Army terms. And I said, I want to be one of those if I got to go in the military. So I decided to go in the Marine Corps, but this was late. In my time, I was now a junior, so I only had one summer. And to be able to graduate and be commissioned, I had to get 2 boot camps in front of me. So I went into the platoon leader class program for the Marine Corps. But I had to do, and there was a summer boot camp between your sophomore and junior year and between your junior and senior year. But I was 1 year behind in that, so I had to go to 2 boot camps in one summer at Auburn. So I went in 61 to Quantico, Virginia, to the boot camp up at Quantico for officers, and went to 1 boot camp and had to walk 26 miles and started over again. At a second boot camp the same summer. And that second boot camp, I had a bunch of guys with me who were having the same experience. And after about 2 days, about half of my second class did what they call a DOR, drop on request. Said, I'm not going to do this again. But the North Georgia experience had prepared me for that, and I was more prepared well beyond most of the other guys who attended that program. So my attachment to North Georgia and the Marine Corps is predicated on the preparation they made for me to attend the platoon leader class program at Quantico for the Marine Corps.
So you graduated Auburn University
62.
in 1962, and now you're commissioned lieutenant
Second lieutenant, yeah.
in the United States Marine Corps.
Yeah, a reserve officer.
A reserve officer.
Yeah, 3 years. It was the commitment I made, but certainly later in my time I became a regular officer, and as I got associated with Vietnam. But I was commissioned by a great Marine called Halliman Smith, and he had been the commanding general of the Marines for the Iwo Jima invasion. And he lived in Montgomery, and there's a little museum down in Montgomery, if I recall, to Halliman Smith.
Where was your first duty station, and your first tour in Vietnam started soon after that, is that correct?
Well, my first duty station, I went through the next level of school in the Marine Corps called the basic school, which is unique to the Marine Corps. And it was about 6 months, and I completed that. And the Cuban conflict was going on. So we thought we were going to war and sending troops ashore in Cuba. So my basic class was designated to be the first replacement draft of young Marine second lieutenants after the war started. So they had to scoot up to do that, but that subsided. And I did a little bit of training in that summer at Quantico. I trained some officer candidates. Then I went to Camp Pendleton, and I joined the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, in what is called a transplacement battalion, and we trained there for a couple of months, and we transplaced to Okinawa. And that tour was 13 months, but it was a month over and a month coming back because we were on ships going over and coming back. So contrast to like now, 6 months, it was 15 months for me in my first trip overseas. And about halfway through that, the Vietnam deal began to click a little bit more, and we began to send more people in. and they put us offshore at Da Nang aboard Navy ships, primarily just circling to be a contingency force in case we had to send trips ashore. But we never really sent our outfit ashore. We sent individuals ashore just to observe and see the terrain and see the area and see what the people look like. So I went ashore a couple of times for that, but never. Our unit was never introduced to Vietnam, and we went back to Okinawa, and we rotated back from Okinawa back to the States.
As a young second lieutenant, and during this point in time, do you remember your thoughts of stepping into Vietnam for the first time?
Well, I think there was a certain element of apprehension and wanting to get engaged because of being a Marine and being an infantry guy. But that first introduction to that environment, and I'm being from Georgia and I never traveled very much in my life, so that was a real experience, just seeing a different kind of people in a different kind of environment. And that was an awakening for me.
How about the terrain in Vietnam outside? Would you just say outside Da Nang?
Outside of Da Nang, we witnessed a little bit of it. You know, it's jungle, and around Da Nang there were big marble mountains, called it Marble Mountain, and up north from Da Nang you had that big what they call Live End Pass. So you had a sort of an indication of all different kinds of terrain, and to the south there were beaches, and the old China Beach and all that. So you had exposure to all different kinds of terrain associated in and around Da Nang.
Were you married during your first?
No, I was a bachelor. Yeah.
And then between 1965 and your second tour in 1967, what career progression and what positions?
Well, what happened was I was a reserve officer, so I decided to go regular. But I was initially assigned to Cherry Point because they thought I was getting out of the Marine Corps. I only had, when I got back, I think 3 or 4 months left. But I went regular, so they transferred me to Paris Island. And I became a series commander, which means I was involved as a lieutenant and later as a captain there in training Marine recruits down at Paris Island. And after that was completed, I went seagoing. I went to Boston, went aboard the USS WASP, W-A-S-P, CVS-17 as the Marine Detachment Commander. And the reason I had the Marines aboard is because of the ceremonial responsibility, but we had nuclear weapons, we had the brig, and we had all the orderlies for the admiral and the captain of the ship. And that was a great experience for a year. And it was out of Boston, and we run up and down the coast chasing Russian subs. Spent a lot of time down in the Caribbean, and had an association, great exposure down in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, all those islands associated with that area. And came back, and the ship was going into dry dock, and I had no desire to go into dry dock. So I told the captain, either get me off the ship or I'm resigning out of the Marine Corps. He said, you got orders to Vietnam, how you like that? I said, I'm fine. And so my second tour to Vietnam again, and I was sent directly to Vietnam shortly thereafter. And my wife stayed here. I was married then, so we got married down at Paris Island while I was a series commander. And she was a school teacher in that area, so we've been married since 1966. And so I went to Vietnam on our long trip. It was a 13-month tour. And I arrived in Da Nang, and they sent me up to Dong Ha to join the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, affectionately called the Magnificent Bastards. And they'd just been beat up pretty bad. They were a pretty beat up battalion when I got there, and Echo was pretty beat up, so a lot of work to do. But the thing about the first day I got there, the commander called me and said, get ready to go on your first operation in 12 hours. And that operation, if you're familiar with Vietnam, it was an infamous area called Ashall Valley. So they were going to send me into Ashall shortly after I got there, but fortunately they called that off and I didn't have to go in. So I had time to do the things I need to do to process the issues with the company and be able to sort of come up with a game plan to do the things I thought I needed to do, make them a better company that's ready to fight, okay. So that was there, and I was associated with the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines for 9 months until I got shot in May of 1968.
Yes, sir. As you became a company commander in Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
trying to rebuild the combat effectiveness
Yeah.
of a Marine Corps company. I imagine operations didn't stop for you.
No, no.
Were there challenges of trying to rebuild while still conducting combat
Yeah,
operations?
it was an interesting dilemma. You know, it was not a clean deal, but yeah, we were relocated to an area which was primarily not North Vietnamese, down in Quang Tri province, was primarily Viet Cong. So they were not as organized and as a larger body of forces. But I said they provided us a great training tool because I used the operations in that area, and we were providing security for the rebuilding of the Quang Tri airfield, or the building of Quang Tri airfield. So they gave us about a month and a half, really just sort of unwind what I'd absorbed and rewind it in my what I thought they needed to be in terms of combat operations and also actual key training. And I was always a nut on getting them physically fit and weapons cleanliness and getting them clean and getting their feet squared away and, you know, making them understand how to take care of their buddy and understanding supporting arms and all the things that need to be accomplished in to be effective in a combat. So we were very busy there. When we were not actually in the bush, as we called it, we were training.
Can you speak to the relationship between your platoon commanders, your non-commissioned officers, while you're rebuilding this company in a combat zone?
Well, I was rebuilding them too. I had all brand new lieutenants, and the idea was for me, you had to build from the top down as well as from the bottom up. And so I really pressed the young officers in terms of their responsibilities and how they go about their training and developing their platoon. Likewise with the squad leaders and what we call the fire team leaders. So we had sort of a operational training sort of mentality for all levels of the company in terms of fire team leaders, squad leaders, and also the individual Marine. So it was a very strenuous program I was putting them through.
How did the young Marines take to that?
Well, it was a new experience for them. They, you know, I wouldn't say they'd been a little slack, but they had been, I think, and they were not used to that. And so they were not used to that level of business. They were used to going out in the bush and coming back and flopping, you know, just not really be doing anything. And I would not put up with that. So it was a very intense program, both while we were in the bush and when we returned. There was no slack in the whole period until I effectively thought that they were ready to be hit what I call the NFL, which would be later the Battle of Dai Do.
And speaking of the Battle of Dai Do, can you talk us through leading up to that battle and what Echo Company's mission was kind of moving into this time period?
Well, initially I was transplaced and assigned to the 3rd Marine Division, and my job was to protect the to protect the bridge on Highway 1, which across the Qua Viet River. Highway 1 ran all the way through South Vietnam up to North Vietnam, across the Qua Viet River and the Ban Hao River, which split South and North Vietnam. And my job was to provide security for that bridge on Highway 1. But concurrently with me providing security, we had a North Vietnamese soldier take a shot on the Qua Viet River at a boat that brought down supplies from the ocean through the river down to Long Ha, and offloaded those supplies, and those supplies would be distributed all along the northern front of South Vietnam to Khe Sanh and all those bases, Camp Carroll, all those bases. And this triggered a response, and the division commander sent part of our battalion down to check out and see what was going on, because this shot, this hit on this Navy craft had killed a couple of sailors, if I recall correctly. And they got out and got in a real fight, and then he fed in the other companies that were not committed as part of that fight. And they got really bogged down in Dai Do village, And they finally said, we're going to have Echo back. So they released me, and I joined the fight, walked down, and they were shooting at us all the way. And we were using snipers and artillery and all that to counter them. And we crossed a creek called Nile Creek and joined the battalion. And at that point, the next morning, after we had joined the battalion commander called me in, but let me walk back a little bit. They had brought in another company from another battalion to attack Dai Do in association with the battalions the companies from 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. And this company did not make it. The company commander got killed, a whole bunch of the Marines got killed, and they were still laying on the battlefield. And I helped reorganize the remnants of that company, but he called me in about 3 o'clock the next morning and said, I want you to attack Dai Do, which is the village we were really focused on. And then on the edge of that village was a golf company who just got on the edge of it and got pinned down. They couldn't move, and the other companies couldn't move. So I was the only company that could maneuver, so I attacked at 5 o'clock that morning, and that's the famous bayonet charge. 180 Marines online, and smoke in the air, and all the kind of artillery coming in, and gunships, and all this kind of stuff working. And I told them to fix bayonets, and we're going for it. And this is the NFL, guys. This is the battle we've been working to be prepared for 9 months. And the Marines understood that. And they did a great job. All of them fixed bayonets, and to have 180 bayonets click at one time is a pretty gruesome sound. But the whole area between where we were located and Dai Do village was open rice paddies. And we had to go across those open rice paddies, just chest up, fire maneuver, which you're familiar with. And we finally got close to it, and the two front platoons, I was between the 2 front platoons, and the reserve platoon behind me got bogged down. And as a consequence, I deployed myself in my command post and the reserve platoon, and we finally penetrated the village of Dai Do. And we fought there for 2 or 3 hours, and I don't know how many people were killed, but it was a lot of people got killed that day. And Echo after that battle, went from 185 down to 35 Marines, either killed or wounded or medevac. And after the fight, and we secured the village of Dai Do and got the Marines coordinated and consolidated, the battalion commander directed another company come around our left flank and begin the attack further north, trying to dislodge all the North Vietnamese that had not been dislodged. And they got about a couple of 100 yards from us and got surrounded. There were only 70 of them, commanded by a young second lieutenant. And he was having, the apprehensions of the second lieutenant. They kept asking, where's Echo? And he thought he was going to have Echo as part of it. And I finally just said, to hell with it. I told my Marines, the 35 Marines, we're going to go help a hotel company, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. So we commenced the walk up to join them and got involved with them. It was a hell of a fight there for a couple of hours. And during that process, I was shot, received a lot of shrapnel, and told the Marines basically to get the hell out of here and leave me. And they drugged me back, and that was sort of the end of my experience in the Battle of Dai Do. But those 70 Marines probably all would have been killed if we hadn't joined them, because they were young and apprehensive, and had a young officer there that really was a little bit insecure and hadn't been there very long, so he didn't understand the intensity of that combat. But we got them all back, and a lot of them got killed, but we did as good as we could do. And that's where I got shot in. I was a medevac.
General, if I could back us up just a little bit to the fixed bayonet command. There's a quote in your book. It's from a Huey crewman, and he said, "I couldn't believe my eyes. These Marines were there with fixed bayonets, moving on to an enemy that was firing at them."
Yeah.
When we think of bayonet charges, we don't really think of the Vietnam War, but
No.
here you are, outskirts of Dai Do, and you're giving the command to 180 Marines to fix bayonets.
Yeah.
What was going through your mind at that time?
I needed something to make it click in their mind. This is going to be intense, and it was going to be tough, and they had to give it up, be prepared to give it all. They had to not only take care of the job we were mission ordered to do, but take care of one another. And there was just something about when you say fixed bayonets that you know this is the real deal. And I wanted them to understand that this was the real deal. And that was the one way I could sort of make them more aware of this being the real deal, okay?
What was your personal emotions at that time?
Get the job done and taking care of the Marines. I never let my emotions get in my way until sort of after the fact sometimes.
Okay. When you were maneuvering that company, and you just alluded to it that you started with 180 men, and by the end of it, there were 35 that were still combat effective.
Yeah.
And you were moving up to support another company within your battalion. What did that scene look like?
Oh, it was, the first couple of 100 yards you didn't see very much, but we immediately came through an area, sort of a build-up area, but it was covered with a lot of bushes and all that kind of stuff. And as soon as we broke out, we could see the issues they were going through. That they were in hand-to-hand combat with the North Vietnamese. So we plowed right in there, and I became the senior man on the scene, and the young lieutenant was very prepared to let me sort of take over, if you will. And we did, and we fought them for a while, and it was pretty nasty, and until I got shot, and everyone was sort of focused on me when I got shot. I knew that was, I needed to figure out a way to get the people who were survivors at this point out of there. And that's the reason I told the battalion commander I'm pulling back, because I knew I couldn't lead them any further. I was down.
And General, before you got shot, you were also wounded by shrapnel, is that correct?
I was beat up with shrapnel pretty bad, and I still beat up a little bit with it. I light off all the meters when I go through the airport.
When you're maneuvering on the enemy at that time with this company, what was their force composition? How many men and how many?
I don't know how many men they had, but they had you think about trying to take 180 men up against 100 bunkers. And these are well-constructed bunkers, but the thing is they designed the bunker where the aperture, they would allow the person who was attacking to get pretty close to them. So I think I had 16 or 17 Marines killed right in that area as we began to try to crack through this big major complex of bunkers. And most of them got shot in the head because they were so close on those bunkers. When the NVA would take them under fire, they'd shoot them in the head. So most of them were headshots.
Did you have time to think about that
process? No. The worst thing you can do is not to continue. The way you reduce your casualty count and trying to get your job done is to continue the attack and let the docs take care of those people who are hit.
In general, you said before your leadership philosophy is leading from the front.
Yeah, you got to smell the gunpowder, as I call it. Yeah.
And you were leading from the front during this time?
I was leading, yeah. When we made the crack through, I was there, and that's where we had some very touchy situations.
Once you're on the objective, and you've taken the city of Dai Do, was there any counterattacks by the enemy?
No, they were pulling back and regrouping, trying to pull all their people out. I'm sorry about this. And that's my wife. But welcome to the Livingston. I guess you can detour it out. You can wipe it out. But this is, I think the thing about it is you just focus on the job, and that's what you have to keep your focus on. Because if you are sort of apprehensive after you see the Marines going down, ultimately you're not going to accomplish your job, and you're going to probably get more killed. And so what's going to be, you just never stop. That's what the docs are for, to take care of those who are down. These are Navy corpsmen, by the way. They call them docs.
And for these actions at Dai Do, you were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor.
I started off with the Navy Cross, which was down below, and it was upgraded myself and the other company commander, Jacob Vargas, who had a golf company. Both of us were put in for the Navy Cross by the battalion commander, but the next level of command, which was a general officer, upgraded him. And they had to come down and do a lot of research about the area because to be submitted for the Medal of Honor, you have to have all this extensive documentation that's corroborated by a lot of details. So it took them a little while to get all that information together and corroborate all the details for both of us. And they submitted it, and after that it takes 2 years. This was 68, and so we were not presented the awards in 1970. And it goes through all these levels of study and corroboration and corrections and making sure everything supports the notion of being a recipient of the Medal of Honor.
Do you recall where you were at and maybe your emotions when you were notified that you were going to be awarded the...
As a matter of fact, I was with the Army down at Fort Benning, Georgia, and I was an instructor at the Army Infantry School, and I was a liaison to the Army Ranger, Airborne, Scout Dog, and Pathfinders. And I was there for a couple of years and close to Auburn, and enjoyed that because I was getting to jump out of perfectly good airplanes and all that kind of stuff. And by the way, I got about 400 jumps while I was there. And got a few butt cracks too. That's part of my back problem now. And I was notified by General Talbot, who headed up the Army Infantry School, a nice fella, and called me up to his office with another Army guy that was also stationed there. And notified us that he'd been called and they were going to award us the award on a Pacific date, and his staff would help coordinate and do all the details of getting us and my family, to include my parents and brother and sister-in-law, to Washington. And so we went through all the coordination and got to Washington and went to the White House, and President Nixon, I think there was about 10, 11 of us there then, awarded us the Medal of Honor that day.
And that was in 1970?
1970, yeah. I think it was February 1970.
And then if we just fast forward a few years throughout your career, you had multiple assignments in between 1970 and your third trip to Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just talk a little bit about those assignments?
Well, after Fort Benning, I was sent back to the the 1st Marine Division on Camp Pendleton, and I became the Director of Division of Schools because of my association with schooling at Fort Benning, and I was there Director of Division of Schools for about a year. Then I became the Operational Director or Operations Officer for the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, and they wanted me they made me in there because they just provided security for the Nixon Western White House, and we did a lot of operations too, and we were one of the most ready battalions. And this was sort of post-Vietnam, and the Marine Corps and the Army, everyone was in bad shape. The Army was going through the volunteer Army concept. The Marine Corps was trying to clean up itself, had all the post-Vietnam, quote, residue, because most of the troops were out of Vietnam at this point. And so I was there, and after then I was assigned to Okinawa, and I arrived on Okinawa in about 74 after moving my wife here to Charleston. And I became the operational head, or the S3 of the 4th Marine Regiment. But I was only there for a short period, and I got a call that they wanted to send me aboard the Blue Ridge, which is a command ship. And I was going to be the eyes and ears for the division commander, because they were anticipating, because of the attitude of Congress and the national military establishment, that we were not going to support Vietnam. Vietnam was having trouble getting supplies and all that stuff, and the politics of this country were just not for Vietnam, and that was sad. And how all that played out. And ultimately, we got involved, and we did initially, and I was not there, but we did initially the evacuation of Cambodia. Then we'd been involved with the evacuation of Vietnamese out of Vietnam, called the RV and evac. That's what the operation was called. But we transitioned from the RV and evac to ultimately Operation Frequent Wind, the evacuation of Saigon. And I was on the ground in Saigon when that happened. It was handed the execute message, and I called my regimental commander, Al Gray, who was a colonel, and said, I got the execute message. this is the option I would recommend, which he agreed with. And they dispatched men, ironically, members of 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, the Magnificent Bastards. I was no longer there, but that was the battalion that was in the queue to do the job, to provide security for the DAL and additional security for the embassy. And we did the evacuation primarily using Marine helicopters, but we had also some Air Force helicopters on the Midway, and they were involved in it. And these helicopters flew for 16 to 17 hours. I mean, these guys were, this was a helicopter operation, nth degree, a major non-combatant operations. And these guys did a wonderful job. The helicopter guys, were the heroes of frequent wind as far as I'm concerned. And we finally concluded the operation, and I flew out with a regimental commander from the old MACP compound where we were located. They were also moving people out from the embassy. And it concluded shortly thereafter, and that concluded frequent wind, the evacuation of Saigon.
General, you were a lead planner for Operation Frequent Wind, is that correct?
Yeah, I was wanting to keep people. That's one reason I was sent down there, because of my operational background.
Can you describe what went into this planning, the planning process of this operation?
Well, there was a very complicated deal because we didn't know what the reaction of Washington would be, what the reaction of the Vietnamese would be, what the reaction to the North Vietnamese would be. So I forget how many options we had, but we had just a buku of options, to include moving out as many as 1 million Vietnamese people. But the one we finally decided on is the one I described earlier, where we flew in and that provided additional security for the MACP compound and for the American embassy. The idea was to get all Americans out, and what Vietnamese we could. Well, I think we got out. I've seen all kind of numbers, and I don't know what number is correct. I really don't. And flew them all out to the ships, and you know the story about a lot of them coming out in helicopters, and we pushed the Vietnamese helicopters as they landed on the ship, pushed them into the China Sea. And I don't know how many of those were pushed into the China Sea, but the Operation Frequent Wind was a great operation. Contrary, it was totally different from Afghanistan. I mean, this was a first-class operation. We really only lost 2 Marines to enemy fire. We had 2 Marines that got killed. They were seated on a motorcycle. And ironically, about 300 yards from me, and a rocket hit the motorcycle and killed them 2 Marines from the embassy. And that was the last 2 Marines, or last 2 servicemen killed in a combat setting or operation in Vietnam. We lost 2 pilots later because their helicopter went into the drink and they couldn't recover the 2 pilots. The crew chiefs and the people in the back out of the helicopter got out, but that was the last casualties of Vietnam. And we finally concluded it and went down to Subic Bay in the Philippines with all these Vietnamese aboard all these ships. And again, I've seen all kind of numbers postulated about how many people we brought out, and Vietnamese we brought out. But the sad thing about it, when we left, we had to leave Vietnamese families with kids standing there because I had 1 helicopter left, and I had a whole bunch of Marines to get out on that helicopter, to include myself and the regimental commander, so we couldn't bring them and we had to leave them.
How many people did the helicopters at that time? How many could they carry?
Well, depending upon the helicopter, we had the old 53A, which was very much looked like, but it's totally different in terms of power from the 53s we have in the Marine Corps now. They probably, at best case, could carry 18, and I had a hell of a lot more on that airplane than that. Let me tell you, we bounced off the trees and everything getting out of there. And we had 46 was the Marine helicopter, and used that on the embassy primarily, bringing people out of the embassy. And it had a few Hueys, but not very many Hueys, primarily 46s and 53s. And the Air Force had the Jolly Greens that they used for down pilot operations. And they had, I think, 8 of those aboard the Midway. And that was I think we had probably 60 or 70 helicopters, but the pilots were just really magnificent, regardless of service. And they did their job, and they did it first class.
You're one of the very last people to leave Vietnam during the Vietnam conflict, the war. As you're riding that helicopter back Do you remember what you were thinking?
Well, what I was thinking about more than anything is the loss of the American life. We lost 68,000 plus people there. And, for us to give up that easy for only one reason, because the National Command Authority and the leadership in Washington didn't have the guts to do what they should have done properly in terms of supplying and support the Vietnamese.
And when you got back stateside or to where you could see news coverage of the evacuation of Saigon, you knowing the intimate details and the operational success that you had planned and been part of that planning process, what do you remember about the news coverage?
Well, it was not very much news coverage. That's the thing about it. I think the country was just trying to, and the press and the leadership in Washington was trying to wipe that out of their mind. And I think when I got back, I was not really, because I had about 6 months left on my tour over there. I went back to Okinawa after we finished the operation, and this was about midway through my tour. So I had 6 months, so I didn't see that phase of the press coverage. But when I got back 6 or 7 months later, just Vietnam was, I think the people were just tired of just the repetitive comments about Vietnam, and the veterans and the people just didn't want to talk about it anymore. It was just, the attitude was, I did my duty. And I think most veterans can really be a testimonial to the fact they did their duty. The people that do their duty is the people who let them down in Washington.
General, you mentioned earlier that Operation Frequent Wind was a lot different from the 2021 evacuation from Afghanistan.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, I was just disappointed, not at the military, not at the people on the military side that did the execute. Again, it was the people on the ground where we didn't have to be confronted with those kind of people. They tried to get involved, but the leadership would not let them get involved, to speak of on the military side. The people in Afghanistan, the pilots, young troopers, the Marines, and all of the young Army guys that got killed and all this kind of business, they did a magnificent job. The breakdown was in the American embassy and the leadership of the American civilian element on the ground, and also the lack of leadership on a lot of senior officers. They were not straightforward in doing their job. They should have put their stripes or their stars on the table and been very frank with the president and very frank with the embassy and the people in the State Department and the people who were trying to micromanage that whole operation. As a matter of fact, the pilot who flew the last plane out, the C-17, lives here in Mount Pleasant, and he and I do a little lecture series, and we contrast frequent wind in that operation, and we've done it 2 or 3 times. But I don't blame it at all. It's not a military problem. It was a leadership at the highest level problem. So I applaud the young pilots and troopers who flew those missions.
Going back just to your service, you're just concluded your 3rd tour in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And multiple different assignments in between, 1975 and your retirement in 1995.
Mm.
Is there one that sticks out to you the most?
Well, I enjoyed. I was a SEAL of the Marine Barracks in London, which was fun, but I also was involved in 2 things. I was involved in the Philippines with a joint U.S. military advisor group when Mr. Aquino got killed. They beat me and some other people to be advisors to the president and the ambassador. And we made the joint U.S. military advisor group more robust because they were having trouble with communist guerrillas. And I was involved in that for about a year. Then I also was Commander General at the Marine Corps ground combat base at 29 Palms, California, and I trained most of the Marines who went to Desert Shield, Desert Storm. I was taking over the brigade in Hawaii, and it got deployed, so they redeployed me from there to California to that base, which is right next to Fort Aaron, the Army base. And I took that base over and was there for about 6 or 7 months doing that job.
General, in your book, I think you talk about being hand selected almost to take over that 29 Palms command position um, at a time when your brigade that you were going to be taking
Yeah.
over in Hawaii was mobilizing for Operation Desert Storm, Desert Shield
Yeah.
in Kuwait 1990. Moving into that position, what were your thoughts and centering around this new charge to train?
Well, I went back to my old Vietnam experiences, and I would bring the battalion commanders in and the unit commanders in, and we'd have a set to, and I give them a little philosophy on preparing for combat and how you prepare for combat, and you stop, and every time you stop, you dig in, and all that kind of stuff. The philosophy I experienced over there, and I emphasize the intensity of the training and the fact intensity saves lives, and preparation saves lives. And here, you put them through the tough times here at 29 Palms, and when you get over there, you're ready for the big one in case the big one comes at you. Okay.
Is there a certain unit that rotated through 29 Palms that saw action in Operation Desert Storm, Desert Shield that sticks out to you?
Well, I think the one that I recall more than all the way, we got the Abram tanks, and we stood those up at 29 Palms. And one of the reserve units, a young reserve unit from Yakima, Washington, and we brought them in and trained them up from the old M60 tanks to the Abram tanks. And they were in too long in Saudi Arabia, and they deprocessed their, quote, new Abram tanks. And they went brown range, these young Marines they were all reserves, basically. Tankers went down range and just kicked the hell out of the Iraqis. I think they only took a couple rounds on a couple of tanks, but they knocked the hell out of them, knocked out about 50 tanks from Iraq, and it was just a demonstration of those kids lived in the desert, they knew how to fight tanks, and they demonstrated that when they got over there. And I always admire that particular action.
That is memorable. After the Operation Desert Storm, Desert Shield, early 1990s, 1990, 1991, you have a few more years left in the Marine Corps. As your career started to draw down a little bit.
Yeah.
What weighed into your decisions about retirement looming in the future? And
well, I took over the Marine Reserves down in New Orleans, and was there, and I reorganized the Marine Reserves, and that was a pretty long, trying sort of experience, but we really got them prepared for the next engagements they would be involved in, and. I talked about going back to Washington and all this stuff, and I got to be very selfish and said, the hell, I need to make some money. And, people think a general officer gets rich. That is not the case at all. We better support the next guy on the block, and maybe not quite, but pretty close. And you don't make the money people think you make. And so I got out and met a guy in New Orleans, and went to work there for about 11 years in New Orleans. And went into banking and helped build a big ATM company and a big master plan community of Biloxi Gulfport of 5,000 acres, and built high-rise buildings, and went and had all the experience. And my wife finally decided she wanted to come back here and be with her mom before she passed, and my mom was in the same situation down in Georgia. So we moved back here and got out just about 2 months before Katrina, and I always tell my wife she was the smartest business person and the whole family. She got us out of there, and we sold out and sold the house and all that before Katrina hit. So that was quite a timely move. But I miss New Orleans. I'm a big New Orleans fan, and one of the things that I got involved in New Orleans that you're aware of is the beginning of the World War II Museum, and I watched it over the years and how successful it's been.
Yeah, it's very successful. Quite the museum. You're also doing some work here in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina currently. Is that correct?
Well, I've done a little work with Yorktown over here, and we build the museums, and they've been trying for a while to build a larger museum, but like I say, unfortunately, probably to my poor leadership, I'll take my hits from it. We haven't been able to succeed in that. We got a really nice Medal of Honor museum over in Yorktown. It's smaller, but it's really nice. But I'm in the banking business still, and I'm part owner in all the boards and all this stuff for Beacons Bank, which is a startup bank what is called a de novo bank. And we started that up about 6 or 7 years ago, and soon to be $1 billion bank. And it's really an ideal community bank. And so I'm still involved in that. And I do a lot of public appearances like this, and you know, trying to age gracefully. At 80, soon to be 86, I'm trying to hang in there as long as I can. You get down and see the Iron Bowl and watch the display completed at the Veterans Center down at Auburn University, War Eagle.
War Eagle. As we start to come to a close, I would be remiss not to mention your family. You mentioned earlier in the interview that you and Miss Sarah have been married since 1966.
And we have 2 daughters. One, Kimberly, is a Naval Academy graduate, and she became a dermatologist. She was a flight surgeon first and a dermatologist, and she became a Mohs sergeant. And she was the dermatologist at the White House for a while. And she lives here in Mount Pleasant. And she's married to a doctor, and they got 1 daughter. And my second daughter's name is Melissa. She graduated from Tulane, and she got a master's out of Villanova. And she owns a goat farm, which got all kind of animals, and got just flocks of kids running out chasing pigs and she makes all kind of soap and all that stuff. She's quite the entrepreneur, and her husband's an executive vice president with Pfizer. She has 2 kids, one at college up in New York, and my grandson is looking at either Penn State or he better be looking at Auburn. I've taken him down twice. And I got to give you a little story about my young Charlie. We took him down there last time, and we had been introduced down at halftime and presented the football by the president's wife. Came back up, and there was a Marine colonel there with his daughter, and they were doing a whiteout day, and all the girls were wearing white dresses. And he came up to introduce himself, and I shook his hand, and he had his daughter with him, and Charlie was standing there. And I mean, she was one good-looking young gal. And she said, my name is, I forget her name, and she was trying to shake hands with Charlie. Charlie tried to move his lips, and they wouldn't even move. And I said, you know, you got overwhelmed there, didn't you, guy? That good-looking young lady just so overpowered Charlie with all her charm. And so that's part of my little recent experiences over there.
Well, as we conclude the interview, and on the note of Auburn University, could you talk about what Auburn University means to you and how your time at Auburn University may have shaped your personal and professional life?
I tell you, Auburn has always been an inspiration. That's one reason I went there. I was inspired by the campus, the people on the campus, the attitude of the people, you know, just the feeling of community there. Unlike some of the other colleges you have experiences with that are in big towns. Auburn was a community centered around the university, and you felt that going there. And it always had that community caring environment about it. And I think the thing you learn from Auburn is the fact that you need to take care of people, understand people, and feel a part of their experiences when they come to your location. And I think Auburn made me feel a part of that Auburn experience, and I've always reflected back on that Auburn experience and the Sigma Pi experience too in the fraternity in a very positive sense about people really setting a good example of wanting to take care of you, make sure you have a good journey through the university and do the best you can do.
And my last question is, do you have any advice for current Auburn University ROTC students, student veterans, engineering students?
I would really say for the young men and young women both, you know, the military is a good track, and the experiences you get through the military, if you don't want to make it a career, at least have the experience and give back to your country. Auburn's giving you a good experience, and they're giving back to you. The country's giving back to you, giving you all these opportunities. Think of your study, but also think about giving back. And I would encourage them to look at what they can do to give back to their country and to the great people of this country. That would be the thing I would recommend to them. As far as the engineer thing that I recall about engineers, which very helpful for me in the Marine Corps even, was the discipline as during the study of engineering, the discipline you learn to make it through an engineering curriculum. You have to be very disciplined about that. That's the reason I told you a story about my initial experience. I learned very quickly to be an engineering graduate from Auburn University, you have to be very disciplined and you have to be very committed and you have to be willing to give up a lot of the things you might enjoy better as a college student if you want to have that opportunity to say that you're an Auburn engineer. So it's a give and take, but I'd say Auburn give to me on all fronts, even the hard study associated with engineering. And that experience helped mold my life about the continuing aspect of being disciplined. And I think that journey was not only in the military, but the journey through Auburn engineering curriculum was part of my success.
One last thing. You mentioned right before the interview that you've returned to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And you've done that several times.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you've also have met up with Vietnamese individuals who...
Yeah, well, the VC chief of the area of the village of Dai Do, I've been back and met him a couple, 3 times, and it's always funny when we get together and we'll sort of have a beer and have a cigar and all this kind of talk about our different experiences. And he's very frank, and he tells me what went on and when he got shot. And he got shot a couple hours after I got shot, and I again, recall my experiences there in his village, and it's sort of, there's no animosity between the two of us at all. And this last time I was over there, he's 89 and I'm soon to be 86. And here we are walking around with our canes trying to race down the trail here. And so he wound up giving me his hat, and I brought that home and I give that to the Medal of Honor Museum. It's always, there's always no animosity, and nothing reflects in his actions or reactions to me. Is there any difficulty between the two of us, continuing to be any difficulty? I think we were just warriors on the scene and we were doing our job.
Thank you so much, General Livingston. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very kindly. And like I say, War Eagle, it's always a pleasure to see people from Auburn.
War Eagle.
Yeah, thank you.
We got